In just under a week, there's going to be a referendum on whether the UK stays in or leaves Europe. Luckily, the issue is pretty simple on both sides. Oh wait, it isn't. It's insanely complicated and is probably the most important decision that's been made in a generation of British life. It's called the British exit, or Brexit, which sounds sort of like a quirky organic cereal. So here's a cheeky little overview of what's been going on recently in T-ville. To get elected last year, the British Prime Minister David Cameron had to promise that he would let the British people decide if we stay in the EU or not. Unfortunately for him, he now has to make good on that promise. And here we are. Depending on which way the vote goes, we either keep strumming our EU lilies or use the emergency Brexit and go our own way. The problem is that the Brexit is an absolute gangbang of special interests. Politicians are politicians and are getting donations from people with a vested interest in leaving or staying. Business is business and wants to make money. And then there's us, the plebs, trying to make sense of this stuff and vote sensibly. There are millions of arguments about what to do, so we're going to stick to the 5 most common ones on each side and go from there. There are 2 camps, the Eurosceptics and the Euro supporters. First then, the Eurosceptics. Here are some reasons why the Eurosceptics want to leave the EU. 1. Free movement. If you're a member of a country in the European Union, you can work wherever you like and move around freely without a visa. Eurosceptics are pretty annoyed about this and often argue that the UK is being flooded with immigrants who are using welfare without justification or flooding the economy with cheap labour. They argue that there are countries like Australia and Canada who already have tight border control, so why can't the UK do the same? 2. EU regulations. Eurosceptics are also pretty worried about the EU Parliament. The EU Parliament can now create laws that have to be obeyed in the UK without going through the UK Parliament. There are also a bunch of officials in the European Parliament who aren't actually elected. Lots of people are worried that this is the beginning of the end for UK sovereignty. 3. Integration. Lots of the EU already uses the euro and is obviously moving towards becoming a kind of super country in its own right. Eurosceptics obviously don't want that to happen. Europe is also talking about getting its own army, which some Brits are quite alarmed about. 4. Economic independence. Lots of people argue that the UK can stand on its own 2 feet and doesn't need to trade inside the EU. The Commonwealth is still a thing, and some economists argue that this could easily sustain us as well as other markets, so why bother being part of the EU? 5. Euro bills y'all. The UK pays somewhere around 12 billion a year to remain a member of the EU, which lots of people think is a bit steep, considering we don't even get a loyalty card or a free hat. If we pull out, we also won't have to abide by European economic regulations, and will be a completely separate economy from the EU, and there is an argument that we might prosper as a result of that. In other words, Brits or GTFO. For those reasons, and lots of others, some Brits think pulling out will hopefully restore former glory, tighter borders, and greater sovereignty to our island nation. However, as some of us may know too well already, pulling out isn't always a reliable method. And that's where the other side comes in, the pro-European argument. Here are some arguments from Brits who want to stay in the EU. 1. Employment. Around 3.5 million jobs might depend on being in the EU, and if we leave, lots of manufacturers might just go abroad. Also, around 10% of the UK's gross national value comes from the financial sector, despite the fact that it's full of complete and utter bankers. 2. Research and funding. Plenty of top scientists in Britain come from elsewhere in Europe. This might change in a big way if we leave. Also, the UK receives a fair bit of money from the EU for research funding, and this could vanish and impact academia. 3. Security. Yes, once we had an empire, but these days we just sit around watching reruns of Fawlty Towers, reminiscing about the good old days of, oh, terribly sorry to bother you, is this your country? Oh good, could we have it please? No? Yoink. Global politics is changing. Certain leaders of very powerful nations, Здравствуйте, ladies, are getting a bit bossy, and there are also nuclear rogue states with itchy trigger fingers. Some Brits argue pulling out is silly when we could be militarily stronger for sticking it out with Germany and France and the rest of the EU. 4. Immigration, but from the other side. For those Brits who live in other EU countries, they may have to go home or at least get married pretty quickly if we leave the EU. Also, if the economy goes tits up again, it means as a British citizen, you won't just be able to swan off to some other country in the EU and start over. 5. Multinational corporations. Every year these corporations do something horrific, and the EU generally steps in and fines their asses. If the UK switches to single player mode, then there's the possibility it could be pushed around a lot more by the likes of certain big financial players. Anyway, that's about 0.5% of all the arguments out there, but you get the idea. Right now, British television is a montage of people screaming at each other, and it's almost impossible to take a definitive position. The Eurosceptics argue that this might be the only chance we have to leave Europe, and we need to seize it now. The pro-Europeans argue that leaving Europe could be a death blow to the economy, and to Britain in general that we never truly recover from. And either position might be correct. No one knows what's going to happen next, but whatever it is going to be pretty bloody historic. So happy voting, and no pressure. It's only the future of our entire country and our great-great-grandchildren that we're deciding. Cheerio!